He had 30 seconds. That's how much time the warning system gave him. 30 seconds between the moment the missile left the ground and the moment it hit his airplane. He never saw it coming. June 2nd, 1995, 26,000 feet above the forests of northwest Bosnia. A clear summer afternoon, except for the clouds below. Captain Scott O'Grady was flying a routine patrol. Same route he'd flown dozens of times, same sky, same mission. And then the sky tried to kill him. This is the story of 6 days that nobody expected him to survive. 6 days in enemy territory. No food, almost no water. Surrounded by soldiers who wanted him dead. And the rescue that 40 aircraft and 200 Marines pulled off in 30 minutes. Under fire, at dawn. If you've never heard this story, you're about to understand why they called him the luckiest pilot alive, and why he would tell you, luck had nothing to do with it. Let's go back. Bosnia, 1995. Most Americans knew the name. Few understood what was happening there. The country of Yugoslavia had fractured for years earlier into a bloody civil war. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, groups that had lived side by side for generations, were now killing each other in numbers that shocked Europe. The city of Sarajevo had been under siege for 3 years. 3 years of sniper fire, of shelling, of civilians dying while trying to cross the street. The United Nations had deployed peacekeepers. NATO had imposed a no-fly zone. The operation was called Deny Flight. What that meant in practice, American pilots, flying out of Aviano Air Base in northeastern Italy, crossed the Adriatic Sea every day and patrolled the skies over Bosnia, making sure no Serbian aircraft violated the zone, showing a flag, trying to make war slightly less total from 30,000 feet up. Scott O'Grady had been doing this since the mission began. He was 29 years old. Born in New York City, raised in the Pacific Northwest. He'd gotten his pilot's license as a teenager, joined the Civil Air Patrol before he was old enough to drive a car. He studied at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Arizona, the school where serious pilots go when they decide flying is more than a hobby. He graduated top of his class, flew missions off the Korean demilitarized zone, then Germany, then Bosnia, 781 hours in an F-16. That's not a lot of time in the air, but it's enough to know the airplane, the way you know your own hands. On June 2nd, O'Grady was flying what they called a two-ship formation, 2 F-16s, side by side. His flight lead was Captain Bob Wright, call sign Basher 5-1. O'Grady's call sign was Basher 5-2. The mission, a standard combat air patrol, an oval pattern over northwest Bosnia, watching, waiting, showing the flag. They both knew the fixed missile sites. The known surface-to-air missile batteries were mapped. You flew around them. What they didn't know was that the Serbs had moved something. A mobile, surface-to-air missile battery. That detail matters more than it sounds. A fixed missile site you can see on a satellite image. You plot it, you avoid it. Problem solved. A mobile battery is different. It moves at night. It changes position. And when it switches on its radar, by the time you know it's there, you're already inside its range. The Serbs had studied NATO. They had watched how F-16s reacted to radar warnings. They had waited. And they had positioned the battery in an area that intelligence had not flagged. A U-2 surveillance drone had spotted the battery earlier. That information never reached the pilots. That fact will matter. For the rest of O'Grady's life, it will matter. If stories like this one, stories that don't get told often enough, are the reason you're here, you know what to do. On the afternoon of June 2nd, the battery's operators watched 2 F-16s fly directly over them. They waited until the planes were almost overhead, the exact spot where the defensive systems in the jet's belly are at their weakest. Then they fired 2 missiles. And they didn't turn on their tracking radar until the missiles were already airborne. 20 seconds of warning, maybe 30. O'Grady heard the alarm in his headset, looked through his canopy, saw nothing. The clouds below him hid everything. He checked his threat warning display. The blip was still there, still locked. A moment later, a second alarm blared over my headset. He started to react. There was no time to finish. The first missile passed between the two aircraft and detonated. The shockwave rocked both jets. Wright's plane shuddered but stayed intact. The second missile came from directly below, up through the cloud cover. Up through the blind spot in the underbelly of O'Grady's F-16. It hit a fuel tank and cut the aircraft in half. What does it feel like when a jet fighter breaks apart around you? O'Grady described it later. The cockpit section separated from the tail. Fire. Spinning. G-forces that pressed him into his seat so hard he couldn't move his arms normally. His wingman Bob Wright watched from the side. He saw O'Grady's plane burst into flames. He saw it break in two. He did not see a parachute. Not one. He reported back to base. His voice was steady. It had to be. Basher 5-2 is down. That sentence would reach Virginia within hours. O'Grady's father, William, a radiologist in Alexandria, would receive a visit from an Air Force chaplain. A typewritten sheet. His son had been shot down. No one had seen him eject. No radio signal had been received. That was the hard part, William O'Grady said later. We never really knew if he was alive. But he was. Barely. Inside the burning, spinning cockpit section, O'Grady reached for what he would later call this beautiful gold handle, the ejection lanyard, between his knees. He pulled it. The seat exploded upward through the canopy. The charge seared his neck and face. He was rocketed into the open sky at 26,000 feet. Cold air. Thin air. Spinning. He opened his parachute manually, didn't wait for the automatic release. And for 25 minutes, he drifted down through the clouds. Into the forests of northwest Bosnia. 25 minutes is a long time to think about what's waiting below. He landed in a clearing south of a highway. Hard. He'd taken burns on his face and neck from the ejection. His shoulder hurt from the impact. He looked around. He was in a field. Trees on every side. He could hear sounds in the distance. Vehicles. Voices. He couldn't tell how far. He had maybe 2 minutes before someone spotted the parachute. He ripped it off. Grabbed the survival kit from under his seat. And ran for the trees. That was the moment the 6 days began. What was in that survival kit? 29 pounds of equipment. A first aid kit. A few signal flares. Extra radio batteries. A 9mm pistol with ammunition. A waterproof evasion chart. A map with notes on edible plants in northwest Bosnia. Dandelion. Licorice root. Nettle. A small amount of water. Some emergency rations. And a radio. The PRC-112 survival radio. About the size of a thick paperback book. Could broadcast voice, Morse code, or a locating beacon. 7 hours of battery life on a single charge. He had 2 batteries. 14 hours of radio time. 6 days to survive. The math was not reassuring. The first night was the most dangerous. Serbian paramilitary forces moved through the area within hours of the shootdown. They had seen the plane go down. They knew roughly where it had hit. They were looking. O'Grady moved through the trees as quietly as he could. No flashlight, no noise. The training kicked in, years of what the Air Force calls SERE school, survival, evasion, resistance, escape. You stay low. You move slow. You watch your shadow. You don't step on dry branches. You stop every few minutes and listen. He found a position in dense brush by midnight. Covered himself with leaves and forest debris, and lay absolutely still. He could hear them. Voices in Serbian, maybe 200 yards away. Maybe closer. A helicopter swept the area with a searchlight. He pressed himself into the ground. Through gaps in the trees, he could see the helicopter. The light. He could see faces through the windows as it passed overhead. He did not breathe. The helicopter moved on, the voices faded. He stayed still until he couldn't hear anything anymore. And then he stayed still for another hour after that. Day 2. He did not use his radio. That sounds like a small decision. It wasn't.
Every pilot who gets shot down wants to call for help immediately. That instinct has gotten pilots captured. The Serbs were listening on emergency frequencies. The moment you transmit, they can begin triangulating your position. If you're on the ground, and they're in the air, they can find you in minutes. O'Grady had been trained to wait, to get distance from the shoot-down site, to find a good position before transmitting. He moved at night, rested during the day, hidden in brush. On the second day, he tried the radio once. A short burst, no response. He shut it off. What he didn't know was that the weather was keeping Allied aircraft too far away to receive his signal. Cloud cover, overcast, distance. His signal was going out. Nobody was close enough to hear it. He didn't know that. He just knew. Silence. He ate ants. He pulled them from the ground with his fingers and swallowed them. Not because it felt survivable, because his body needed calories and ants were there. He chewed leaves, grass, whatever his evasion chart said might be edible in northwest Bosnia. He rationed the water in his emergency pack carefully. By day 4, it would be gone. The rain came, cold, persistent, soaking. In the Bosnian forest in early June, it rains the way it rains in the Pacific Northwest. Not dramatic, just relentless. He collected rainwater with a sponge from his survival kit, squeezed it into a plastic bag, drank it. The same rain soaked him through, and stayed there. By day 3, his feet were in bad shape. Trench foot, the kind that happens when your boots stay wet for days. The skin breaks down. Walking becomes its own problem. He kept walking, at night, through the trees, looking for high ground from which to transmit, looking for a clearing large enough for a helicopter, looking for a position that wasn't visible from 3 directions. He was doing math in his head constantly. Every decision was a calculation. How much battery to use, when to move, where to hide. How loud was that sound? How close was that voice? A wrong answer to any of those questions, and the math stopped mattering. But let's go back to the forest, because the story of those 6 days deserves more than a summary. Day 3. He was moving through pine forest in the dark when he heard voices directly ahead. Serbian paramilitary fighters. 4 of them, maybe 5. Close enough that he could hear individual words. He dropped, flat to the ground, face in the leaves. They were on a path he'd been about to cross. If he'd moved 30 seconds faster, he would have walked into them. He lay there for close to 2 hours, listening to them talk, listening to them move, listening to them search. They had flashlights. The beams swept back and forth through the trees. One beam passed within 20 feet of where he lay. He had leaves on his back, leaves on his legs, his face pressed into the forest floor. He was wearing olive drab, not perfect camouflage, but enough to break up the human outline in the dark. The beam moved past. The voices continued. Then they faded. Then they were gone. He waited another 40 minutes before he moved. That's the discipline that saved him. Not the moment of hiding, the 40 minutes after. The instinct when danger passes is to move, to put distance between yourself and the threat, to do something. The training says, wait, because the threat hasn't necessarily passed, because movement creates sound, because the safest thing to do after a close call is to do nothing for a long time. He waited. Then he moved. Day 4. The water in his emergency pack ran out. He had rationed carefully. Small sips at specific intervals. But 4 days of movement and fear burns through whatever you carry. He checked his evasion chart. Looked at the illustrations of edible plants.
The problem is that most edible plants in northwest Bosnia in June look like every other plant in northwest Bosnia in June. You need to know what you're looking for. He found dandelion. He recognized nettle. He ate them raw. The ants were easier to identify. He found a column of them moving along the log. He picked them off with his fingers. Dozens of them. It's not exactly a meal, but the human body can extract calories from almost anything. And almost anything is better than nothing. The rain started again on day 4. Heavy this time. He spread his evasion chart flat and let the rain pool in the folds. Brought it to his mouth. Drank. When you're dehydrated enough, rainwater pooling in a plastic map feels like the best thing you've ever tasted. He found a small stream on day 4. He didn't drink from it immediately. He watched it for 20 minutes first. If it was near a settlement, there would be debris. If it was near a road, there might be movement. It was clean, isolated. He drank. He filled everything he had that could hold water. And then he moved away from the stream. Because if he needed it, other people did too. And other people had weapons. What does fear actually feel like when it runs for 6 days? Not the sharp fear. Not the moment the missile hit fear. That kind of fear burns itself out. The kind that stays is different. It's a constant background calculation. Is that sound natural or not? Was that branch breaking from wind or from weight? Is the light getting brighter, which means exposure, or is it just the clouds shifting? Your body adjusts to it. The constant adrenaline becomes normal. You stop feeling the cold. You stop noticing the hunger in the same way. What you feel instead is a kind of hyper-awareness. Every sense working at a level they don't usually reach. O'Grady said later that he'd never felt more present in his life than in those 6 days. When you're trying to survive, he said, the future doesn't exist. The past doesn't exist. There's only what's happening right now, in this exact moment. He wasn't prepared for how much he would miss that clarity. When he came home, to the White House, and the cameras, and the Senate committee, and the book deals, it took him a long time to settle back into ordinary life. Because ordinary life doesn't require that kind of focus. And focus, once you've used it to stay alive, feels like the most important thing there is. Let's talk about the Bosnian conflict for a moment. Because O'Grady's story didn't happen in a vacuum. Bosnia in 1995 was the site of the worst atrocity in Europe since World War II. That summer, the same summer O'Grady was shot down, Serbian forces under General Ratko Mladic entered the United Nations safe zone of Srebrenica. More than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys were executed over a period of days. Shot, buried in mass graves. That word, genocide, was eventually applied to what happened at Srebrenica. The Bosnian War lasted from 1992 to 1995. Merely 100,000 people died. And NATO, the most powerful military alliance in history, spent 3 years flying patrols and enforcing a no-fly zone while the killing continued on the ground. There are arguments about why. About political will, and rules of engagement, and the limits of air power. Historians and military analysts have been working through those arguments for 30 years. What is clear is this. O'Grady's shoot-down happened in the context of an alliance that was struggling to define what it was willing to do. And his rescue, a clean, precise, successful operation that brought home an American pilot and put every Marine back on the ship, was exactly the kind of success the war had been missing. It demonstrated capability. It demonstrated will. It demonstrated that when NATO committed to something, it could execute. That mattered. And 6 weeks later, when the decision was finally made to strike, really strike, the Serbian military positions, the alliance had just reminded itself that it could. There's another part of this story that doesn't get told enough. The intelligence failure. The mobile surface-to-air missile battery that shot down O'Grady had been spotted. A U-2 reconnaissance drone, a high-altitude unmanned surveillance aircraft, had identified the battery's position. The information existed.
The coordinates were in a system somewhere. They were not passed to the pilots. The disconnect between what intelligence knew and what the pilots in the cockpit received is the kind of failure that militaries spend decades trying to fix. In O'Grady's case, that failure cost him 6 days in the forest. It could have cost him everything. After his rescue, there were reviews. Procedures were examined.
The way information about mobile missile threats was transmitted to pilots was changed. O'Grady never blamed anyone publicly. Not the intelligence community, not the Air Force, not the mission planners. He was a captain. He followed orders. He flew the mission he was assigned. But the failure exists in the record. And it's worth knowing that his survival, in some sense, required him to recover not just from a missile strike, but from a system that didn't protect him the way it should have. He recovered from both. Here's what 1995 looked like for the country he came home to. Oklahoma City had been bombed on April 19th. 168 people killed. The worst domestic terrorist attack in American history at that point. The O.J. Simpson trial was consuming the national conversation. The economy was doing reasonably well, but the anxieties of the post-Cold War era were starting to crystallize. What was the threat now? Who was the enemy? What was the country for? Into that moment walked a 29-year-old Air Force captain from Spokane, Washington, with burns on his face and a story about ants and rainwater and 6 nights in the Bosnian forest. He was exactly what the moment needed. Not because his story was simple. It wasn't. Not because the war was over. It wasn't. Not quite. But because he had faced something real and specific and survived it. And because the Marines who went to get him had done exactly what they were supposed to do. In a moment when the country was wrestling with what it stood for. That mattered. O'Grady accepted the attention gracefully. He gave the credit to God, to his training, and to the Marines. He never claimed to be more than he was. That made people trust him. And that trust lasted. One last detail. In September of 2011, Scott O'Grady announced that he was running for Texas State Senate. He lost the Republican primary. He returned to commercial real estate. The arc of his public life after Bosnia is quieter than you might expect for a man who met the president and wrote a bestseller and had a film loosely based on his story. But that's also in keeping with what he said about what he learned. He learned to be in the present, to be content with where he was, not to chase the next thing at the expense of the thing that was happening right now. He was a pilot. He survived. He came home. What happened after that was just life. And after 6 days in the Bosnian forest, he was qualified to appreciate it. There's a piece of Scott O'Grady's F-16 on display in Moscow. The fin structure from the downed aircraft. The Serbs recovered it and eventually handed it over to Russia for technical evaluation. You can see it in the museum of the Moscow Aviation Institute. That image stays with you. A piece of an American fighter jet in a Russian museum. Because a mobile missile battery that intelligence knew about, but didn't tell the pilots about, did its job. And the pilot of that jet ate ants for 6 days and came home. America went to the moon. America built the most capable military in human history. And sometimes, the way a conflict ends is that a 29-year-old captain lies in a ditch in northwest Bosnia for 2 hours, listening to Serbian voices get closer and then farther away, and makes the right decision about when to move. The big picture and the small one. They connect at exactly that ditch. Scott O'Grady is in his late 50s now. He lives in Texas. He runs his business. He gives the occasional speech. When people ask him about Bosnia, he answers the same way he always has. He was doing his job. The Marines were the heroes. The training worked. He doesn't elaborate much beyond that. What is there to elaborate? 6 days. Ants and rainwater. A radio barely larger than a paperback book. And when he finally said his name into the dark, someone answered, "That's the story. That's all of it, and it's enough." Back in Italy,
At Aviano Air Base, the mood was different kinds of dark. Bob Bright had come home without his wingman. The squadron, the 555th Fighter Squadron, the Triple Mickle, knew what that meant, or thought they knew. Search aircraft went out, carefully, because the same missile that got O'Grady was still out there. And the crew of a search aircraft that gets shot down while looking for a downed pilot is just more people to find. The Serbs, the day after the shoot-down, broadcast television footage of the wreckage. The tail section of O'Grady's F-16, lying in a field, proof of their success. The Serbian television footage went around the world. There were rumors. He'd been captured. He was dead. The signals from his radio, brief, intermittent, had been detected. But the pattern was strange. Short bursts, then nothing, then a short burst again. It might have been the automatic beacon from the wreck. It might have been a pilot trying to conserve battery. Nobody could be sure. Days passed. By day 5, many officials in Washington had quietly concluded that Captain Scott O'Grady was probably dead. His squadron mates, the men who had flown with him and eaten breakfast with him and knew the sound of his voice, they were starting to move through the particular grief of military units that lose someone. Not dramatic, not expressed, just present. And then, just after 2 in the morning on June 8, day 6, something changed. Captain Thomas O. Hanford was on patrol. Routine combat air patrol, northwest Bosnia, roughly the area where Basher 5-2 had gone down. He was low on fuel. Almost time to turn back. He had his radio on the guard frequency, the emergency channel all down pilots know to use. At 2:08 in the morning, Bosnia time, a voice came through. Basher 5-2. This is Basher 5-2. I'm alive. I need help. Hanford almost didn't believe it. He had known O'Grady since Aviano. He recognized the voice. But protocol requires confirmation. You verify. You ask the questions only the real person could answer. 12 minutes of radio procedure. Code words. Authentication. Confirmation. 12 minutes that felt longer than 6 days. And then Hanford transmitted back to base. Basher 5-2 is alive. I have his position. What happened next took 40 minutes to set in motion, and 30 minutes to execute. The USS Kearsarge, an amphibious assault ship, was in the Adriatic Sea, closer to the Bosnian coast than it had been at the beginning of the week, moved there deliberately, on the possibility that O'Grady might still be alive. Admiral Leighton Smith, NATO's Southern Europe commander, had put the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit on standby. Colonel Martin Berndt commanded that unit. Smith called Berndt at 4:40 in the morning. Execute. That's all. One word. And 40 aircraft began to move. The rescue force was not small. 2 CH-53E Super Stallion helicopters, 32 tons each, carrying about 20 Marines apiece. 2 AH-1W Super Cobra gunships, armed and flying escort. 2 AV-8 Harrier jump jets for close air support. And roughly 40 other aircraft, fighters, electronic warfare planes, tankers, loitering in the area in case the Serbs caught on to what was happening. The Super Stallions flew more than 80 miles into Serb-held territory, at low altitude, 150 feet off the ground. 175 miles per hour. Flying that low over terrain that fast in the dark is not the same as flying at 30,000 feet in a fighter jet. The pilots had to watch for power lines, for trees, for hillsides that came up fast. They went in anyway. In the forest, O'Grady had been awake since contact. After Hanford's voice came through, he'd moved. Found the position he'd been calculating for days. High enough to transmit, open enough for a helicopter, sheltered enough to wait. He had his 9mm pistol in his hand, not because he expected to fight his way out, because if Serbian forces arrived before the Marines did, he was going to make a decision. He waited. The sky was getting lighter.
That was the problem. Every minute of dawn that passed made him more visible. Made the helicopters more visible. Made the whole operation more dangerous. At 6:44 in the morning, he heard them. The sound of CH-53s is distinctive. Heavy. Rhythmic, loud. It doesn't sound like a Serbian helicopter. It doesn't sound like anything except rescue. He ran from the tree line into the clearing, pistol in his hand, yellow smoke flare burning beside him. Marines poured out of the helicopter before it fully touched down. They covered the tree line in every direction. Weapons up. One of them grabbed O'Grady and pulled him aboard.
He was shaking, unshaven, burned on his face and neck, 30 pounds lighter than he'd been 6 days ago. The helicopter lifted. They weren't safe yet. On the way out, Serbian forces fired. Surface-to-air missiles. Small arms. 3 shoulder-launched missiles tracked the helicopters. The pilots jinked. Hard banking turns at low altitude, throwing off the missile's guidance. Small arms fire hit both helicopters. O'Grady heard the rounds impacting the fuselage from inside. He was in the same situation he'd been in 6 days ago, at the mercy of whatever was outside. One round hit Sergeant Major Angel Castro's body armor. It didn't penetrate. He wasn't injured. The helicopters kept flying. At 7:15, the formation crossed the coastline. Feet wet. Over water. At 7:30, they landed on the Kearsarge. The ordeal was over. What did 6 days in the Bosnian forest actually cost him? Trench foot. Shoulder burns from the ejection. Facial burns from the ejection. Dehydration, significant weight loss, and something harder to put into a medical report. He described it himself, years later. He said he had been a man who was always living in his future, always thinking about what came next, the next promotion, the next assignment, the next thing. 6 days with nothing but the present moment changed that. I learned that there's no guarantee that tomorrow will come, he said. And it's okay to plan for your future. But you need to be content and happy with where you are and what you're doing in life at this very moment. Or happiness will escape you. That's not the kind of thing you say unless you've had reason to say it. He came home to something he hadn't expected. Within days of June 8, his face was everywhere. This was 1995. The country had been through something, the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King verdict. The Branch Davidian siege in Waco. The Oklahoma City bombing, just 6 weeks before O'Grady was shot down. America needed a story that didn't end badly. O'Grady gave them one. He met President Clinton at the White House. He testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. He spoke at churches, at schools, at military bases. He wrote 2 books. One of them became a New York Times bestseller. He answered the same questions, over and over again. How did you do it? What kept you going? Were you scared? He always answered the same way. Faith, training, the thought of his family. And the knowledge that people were looking for him. I was just doing my job, he would say. He wasn't being modest. He meant it literally. The Air Force had trained him for exactly this situation. He had applied the training had worked. That's the whole story. As far as he was concerned. The heroes, he insisted, were the Marines. Let's talk about what actually went right. Because this story is more than just a survival story. It's a story about a system that worked. 3 things had to happen for O'Grady to come home alive. First, he had to survive 6 days on the ground without being captured. That required training, discipline, and decisions that were right more often than they were wrong. He made mistakes. He transmitted too early on day 4. He moved when he should have stayed still at least once. He was spotted near a Serbian patrol on day 3, not by the patrol, but close enough that he spent the next 2 hours motionless in a ditch. But the pattern of his decisions was sound. Move at night, hide during the day, conserve the radio, eat what was there, trust the training. Second, someone had to hear him. Hanford being on that frequency at 2 in the morning wasn't luck. The Air Force had kept aircraft in the area, at personal risk, flying carefully to avoid the same missiles that got O'Grady, for 6 days, cycling through the emergency frequencies, listening. Someone was always listening. Third, the Marines had to get there before anyone else did. The 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit had rehearsed combat search and rescue operations. They knew the CH-53E inside out. Colonel Byrne had made sure his people were ready. When the Admiral said, "Execute," at 4:40 in the morning, his Marines were already moving. All three things happened. And that's why there's a story to tell. Here's something that gets overlooked. 6 weeks after O'Grady's rescue, on August 30th, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force, a massive airstrike campaign against Serbian military targets. It worked. It broke the siege of Sarajevo. It brought the Serbs to the negotiating table.
It led directly to the Dayton Peace Accords, signed in November of 1995. The war, for practical purposes, was over. Was O'Grady's shoot-down a factor? Almost certainly. The embarrassment of a NATO aircraft being knocked out of the sky by a mobile missile battery, with no warning to the pilots, because intelligence hadn't passed the information through, pushed the alliance toward more aggressive action. O'Grady didn't start the final phase of the war, but his story was part of what ended it. That's worth knowing. What do you do with a story like that? A 29-year-old pilot. 6 days. Ants and rainwater. A 9mm pistol and a radio the size of a paperback book. And Marines flying 80 miles into enemy territory in the dark. At 150 feet off the ground, to bring him home, what do you do with it? You remember it. Because it answers a question that comes up more often than you'd think. The question is, does training actually work? Not in theory, in a ditch in the Bosnian forest at 2 in the morning, when you're dehydrated and your feet hurt and you've been eating insects for 5 days and you don't know if anybody's coming. Does training work then? The answer, in O'Grady's case, was yes. Every decision that mattered, when to transmit, when to move, when to stay still, how to read terrain, how to ration water, how to manage fear, was the product of something the Air Force had put in his head before he ever set foot in Bosnia. He didn't invent his survival. He executed it. There's a difference. He left the Air Force eventually, moved to Dallas, got into commercial real estate. Speaks at corporate events about leadership and resilience. The fame faded, as it always does. The country moved on, as it always does. But somewhere in the hills of northwest Bosnia, in a forest that looks like it always looked, the terrain still holds the shape of what happened there. A clearing where a parachute came down. Brush dense enough to hide a man. A slope with good elevation and a line of sight to the sky. He found those places in the dark, with nothing but his training and his judgment and his willingness to keep moving when every part of him wanted to stop. And when he finally got to the right spot, and turned the radio on, and said his name into the dark, someone was there. 20 years later, a journalist asked him what the experience had given him. He paused, not the polished pause of a man who's answered this question 1,000 times. A genuine pause. I was always living in my future, he said. I learned that there's no guarantee that tomorrow will come. He looked out the window of his Dallas office. It's okay to plan for your future. But you need to be content and happy with where you are and what you're doing in life at this very moment. He let that sit for a second, or happiness will escape you. 6 days, ants and rainwater, and that's what he took from it.
Not the heroism, not the medals, not the White House meeting. A different relationship with the present tense. That's the story of Scott O'Grady. Not a pilot who got lucky, a man who was trained for the worst thing that could happen to him. And when the worst thing happened, he was ready, and the Marines came. And he came home. If you watch this story to the end, write one word in the comments. Alive. And tell us what city you're watching from.